Now, traditional archery is something which has got quite a lot of attention and a big resurgence and revival in recent years. From Japanese and Manchu archery through to Native American and English warbow. And not just on foot, of course, but also on horseback. Whether it's in Hungary or whether it's in Japan, you can now learn traditional horseback archery, something which was incredibly important in medieval warfare. But in my opinion, there's a weapon which doesn't get enough attention, and another martial arts style which has been forgotten. And that is the more ancient weapon of the spear, aka the javelin. And the fact is, the spear is an older weapon than the bow, and in this video we're going to look specifically at the use of the javelin on horseback, the forgotten martial art. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, all of you watching this channel undoubtedly know the spear is probably one of the most ancient weapons used both for hunting and of course for war with other humans. But one of the things which often gets overlooked is that javelins, or smaller spears, and sometimes in fairness larger spears and lances, were used for throwing from horseback throughout history. And in fact it's even been turned into a sport, or rather survived as a sport, called jarid or jereed in Turkey today. Now, a lot of Turkish people don't even know about this sport, but it is still practiced. There are still tournaments, there's still a sort of national championship. And this is the sport that descends from one of the original ancestor martial arts trainings for use of the javelin from horseback. And it's really important to point out that while this has survived in Turkey, thankfully, as a sport and a martial art still to this day, obviously throwing spears and javelins from horseback is probably something which goes as far back as the domestication of horses used for riding. So as soon as people were riding on horses, they were undoubtedly finding ways to use the weapons that they already had available to them, of which spears were probably one of the most predominant, from horseback. So probably the use of the javelin on horseback, I would guess, predates the use of bows on horseback by a very considerable way. Now, it's fair to point out, of course, that bows can achieve a range far exceeding that we can throw javelins at. It doesn't matter how you optimize the javelin, even if you use some throwing aid like a thong or an atlatl or something like this, you can never really get the ranges that you can get out of a really distance optimized bow. And it's probably fair for the most part to say that bows are generally speaking more accurate, certainly at longer ranges. Maybe not at close range, maybe you can be pretty damned accurate with a javelin at close range, but at long ranges, really bows are king. But the spear or thrown javelin does have some advantages over the bow. Firstly, with a bow, we store up a huge amount of energy and then release it. But once we've released it, fundamentally all we've got is an object which, number one, has a given mass, which is really quite light, certainly compared to a spear. It has quite fast velocity, but maybe not as fast as you would think. Traditional bows tend to max out at about 200 FPS, but this is a fairly light object. In contrast, if I put the bow down for a second and pick up the spear, this has a much larger amount of mass, even though this is a fairly large and fairly light little spear actually. But spears and javelins in general have a lot more mass. Yes, they're moving slower, but they have a lot more mass than the arrow. That means that they are perfectly adapted, or rather better adapted, for things like penetrating things like shields or potentially armour. We'll come back to that point in a minute. So these are heavier hitting, harder hitting, they carry a lot of momentum due to their mass. But in addition to that, there is a big advantage which these have over an arrow and a bow. With an arrow and a bow, you absolutely pretty much have to have some kind of hand weapon as backup. If you're a Native American, then maybe a club or a tomahawk. If you're an English archer, then a sword and a buckler, and so on and so forth. But with one of these, not only do you have the ability to throw the thing, be it a large spear, if you're a hoplite, for example, a large spear you could throw, but in addition, it is also a hand weapon. So if you're a Zulu or whoever else using a javelin or spear, not only is it a throwing implement, but it's also a stabbing implement. Unless you're Legolas, and in most situations, these are rubbish hand weapons. That being said, most people that used the javelin being thrown from horseback, people like the Mamluks, the Persians, and indeed the Ottoman Turks, usually had additional hand weapons. So these weren't usually primarily hand weapons, these thrown javelins from horseback. Their primary quality seems seems to be around the fact that they are extremely hard hitting, which makes them uniquely effective, number one against armour, but also in hunting against really large beasts like elephants or hippos, for example. So it does seem that while bows are always going to be superior for range, usually for accuracy and also for volume of missiles, because you can carry so many arrows, for close-up combat, slightly beyond hand reach, javelins have a really important role to play, and I would say have been largely ignored actually by modern students of arms and armour, and really there's a lot more to be said about them. So let's look at one specific type of throne-mounted javelin popular in the Ottoman Empire, known as the jarid. This video today is sponsored by Raycon, and now that the holidays are over, it's the perfect time to get upgrading your gear. And Raycon have got a great sale going on right now for New Year, so don't miss out. And with Raycon's bone conducting headphones, they sit just outside your ear hole, which means that if you're out and about, walking, cycling, running, doing any kind of sports, you can still hear, and it's really good for safety. And given that your ear holes are open, not only is it great for safety and awareness, or even chatting with your mate that you're running with, but also really good for keeping an ear out for what the kids are up to. And I really love that over the Christmas period, with all of the madness of all of the family being around, I've been able to keep up with my favourite podcasts and audiobooks. And they're also super comfortable, so much so that I often forget I've even got them on. They also last a massive 13 hours battery life, and they've got IP68 waterproof and dustproof protection, so they're great for exercising outdoors. And one of the other things I love about them is that when you take them off, you can stick them around your neck, and they stay there, so you're not losing little earbuds and trying to find them all the time. Raycon's got the quality to rival the big audio brands, but at half the cost. So now's the perfect time to upgrade your audio for the new year. So check out that link down below, or go to buyraycon.com/ScholaBC, that is /ScholaBC, and you'll get a massive 20% off site-wide. So thanks once again to Raycon for sponsoring this video. Check out the link down below. So thanks for sticking with me. Now back to the main content of this video. Let's look at the Turkish or Ottoman jarid or jarid. So one of the first things to note about the jarid or jarid is that it's a relatively short javelin. This is really what marks them out as different to most javelins throughout most of the world and throughout most of history. So most javelins are essentially light versions of spears, but the jarid or jarid is really short, usually between 3 and 4 feet, more towards 3 feet usually, so usually about 3.25 feet long, so really quite short. But one of the advantages of them being so short is they're easier to carry, and they can be carried like a sword in a kind of sheath or scabbard. Indeed, these jarids could be carried in a sort of quiver or scabbard, if you like, and this could in turn be attached to the horse equipment, the saddle or whatever. It could also be carried on foot as well. So we sometimes see people on foot carrying these sort of quivers, sometimes they're carried on horseback. And sometimes they carry multiple jarids, so sometimes one, but sometimes 2, and sometimes 3. I don't recall seeing one with more than 3, but it's not uncommon to find them in sets of 3, so you can be on horseback and obviously chuck these 3 things as and when it's convenient. And there is a even more unusual version where actually there's a type of sword scabbard with a tube essentially mounted into the scabbard to actually put one jarid in there. So as well as seeing sets of 2 or 3 jarids, we sometimes see a sword and a jarid together in one unified scabbard. Now the jarid is also interesting for its form and construction. So the first thing to note is the heads on these. Now there is some variation, but generally speaking they always have quite narrow heads on them, and in fact some of the heads are triangular or square, sometimes with a cannular or fullered construction, a little bit like some rondel daggers or the armour penetrating points on the top of certain European pole axes. Now this does lead us to the conclusion that probably the jarid was seen as quite effective against armour. And in fact we know that they were used all the way back into the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, still being used in the 17th and the 18th century, so they had a very long life. But during that period, people in, for example, the Ottoman Turkish Empire, what's now Iran or Persia, the Mamluks for example, they are predominantly wearing, their main armour type is mail, aka chainmail. Now they did have elements of plate as well, However, if most of your body is covered in mail or chainmail, then indeed this type of javelin with essentially like a large bodkin point is going to be quite effective if it hits you anywhere on the armoured body. And of course, sometimes the horses might be targeted instead of the person. So you want deep penetration on an animal that you're hitting, because you might target the horse rather than the rider. But in addition, sometimes the horses are wearing protective equipment of their own. So these seem to be very short range, hard hitting and deep penetrating, according to the form of the head, missiles used at short range and carried in multiples because they're short. Now, in terms of the construction, usually if it's a wooden shaft or sometimes reed, the word jarid is actually Arabic and could come from the use of certain types of reed originally for the original ones. We find a socket between the head and the shaft, quite normal for a spear. But some of them are entirely metallic, particularly the later period ones, so the sort of 17th and 18th century ones. Now, they aren't a solid metal shaft. Usually, as far as I'm aware, they're usually hollow, so they're usually formed like a tube. So we have a metal tube. Sometimes they're quite plain, sometimes they're quite ornate. And if they are ornate, they can have incised, they could have etching, they could even have gilding for really high status people. And at the back end, we find either a section which is sort of a bit like a handle, and that's for pulling them out of the sheath, because they're completely embedded inside the quiver or sheath when they're in there to keep them secure. Or we find a sort of flat end. Now, this flat end could be interpreted as a sort of flight to assist the flight thing. Maybe it is, or maybe it's simply to make them easier to pull out. In any case, the jarid essentially breaks down into three main parts. We have the head, we have the shaft, and then we have a little tail section at the back end, which could indeed be the ease of access, pulling it out of the scabbard part. And then very occasionally we find very ornate examples which have a delineated region in the middle with decoration, incised bits, which shows the gripping point, the balance point, which is the best point at which to hold it and throw it. So lastly, let's talk about the sport of jarid, which is still practiced today in Turkey. As I mentioned, there's tournaments, there's many different teams. I think, if I remember correctly, there's about 50 different teams. They even have like national championships. So this is very much a surviving tradition. It's not revived, it's just been going the whole time, and it's not as popular these days as it used to be. In fact, a lot of modern Turkish people have never even heard of it, or certainly never seen it in the flesh. So jarid is very much a traditional martial art of the Ottoman Empire, but it wasn't only practiced by the Turks. We know it was also done in Mamluk Egypt and in Persia, in India, all sorts. So this is a sport and martial art which has evolved over time, but is very much a survival. So first of all, they are on horseback. I sadly can't ride well enough to demonstrate this for you, but they're on horseback and they are superb horsemen, akin to polo, for example. So they mostly use Arabian horses, or in fact Turkic horses, which are very agile. They don't necessarily use the biggest or fastest horses. In fact, particularly tall horses are regarded as not being agile enough for the sport. So they specifically use Arabian horses and other similar breeds, which are very maneuverable and agile. Okay, so they need to be very good at dodging and turning around and this kind of stuff. And they have a short javelin. Now these days they are usually made of poplar wood, usually with a rubber end for safety, for the safety of the rider and also the horse, of course. Traditionally, they tended to use slightly longer, slightly heavier shafts, but the main point here is it's a little bit like dodgeball. So they've got a huge, great arena, and they're riding around trying to tag each other with the javelins. But here's the thing, when a person throws a javelin at you, you've essentially got two main options, okay, to deal with the attack anyway. One of them is obviously to dodge. So if you're riding along and someone throws a javelin at you, you can dodge your body, or you can dodge the entire horse, or the body and the horse. So there's an element like dodgeball of there dodging the javelin. But the other option is, as the javelin comes in at you, you can actually catch the javelin and then throw it back at the person, or you can catch the javelin and there's some kind of scoring system that I don't fully understand. So your main options are to dodge or to catch it. Now catching it is super interesting because we actually have this as a concept for example, in Viking related things going all back into Icelandic sagas, but in other cultures as well, there's this idea that if someone throws a spear or javelin at you, if you're very, very skilled, if you're kind of elite pro level, you can catch the spear, obviously dodge as well, but dodge and catch it, turn it around, and then immediately throw it back at the person. And this is seen as very elite high skill. Now imagine doing it on horseback. Crazy. I've got super admiration for these guys. What a brilliant and amazingly fun sport. Okay, so you can dodge, you can catch, but here's the thing as well. Remember that in the original martial art of this, not only are these throwing implements, but you could potentially use them as hand weapons as well. And it's very clear that the sport of jarid, which was carried out extensively, certainly from the 16th century in the Ottoman Empire onwards, but it seems to have its roots probably in the, well, they say the 11th century actually, but certainly we've got solid references to it from the 14th century. So it is a medieval practice. But not only is it teaching the people to use javelins and catch javelins and dodge javelins, but in addition to that, it's also teaching them how to use their horses and potentially the hand weapons that they use, lances, maces, swords as well, because learning that degree of maneuverability and agility on your horse and dodging and weaving and catching are all things which can be directly applied to hand weapons. And there's another final connecting point. One of the other ways of defending yourself in the sport of jarid, even today, when someone throws a spear at you, is actually to knock it aside, to parry. So if a spear is, or sorry, a javelin is coming in towards you, you can actually bash the thing out of the way. Now this is something we see in medieval European treatises against thrown weapons, thrown swords, thrown spears. We find it in Fury, we find it in Talhofer and a bunch of other sources. And obviously the Ottoman Turks were doing the exact same thing at the same time. So if a javelin comes in at you, you could be holding your javelin ready to throw. The javelin comes in at you, say you don't have time to dodge. Obviously you can't catch it because one hand's holding the reins, unless you let go of the reins, I guess. But you've got a weapon in your own hand. What you can do is actually knock the incoming javelin out of the way, bam, and then throw your javelin back. So it's actually a really advanced and practical battlefield martial art, as well as, of course, being applicable to hunting big game. And remember, of course, that while you're doing this only with javelins in the sport of jarid, learning to weave and dodge with your horse and knock things out of the way could be applied against someone throwing any kind of spear or lance against you, or a javelin if you're holding a sword and mace. So it's extremely practical skill building, muscle memory, for the horsebound martial artist, or sipahi as it would have been called in Turkey. So hopefully this video will go some way towards rectifying the fact that in general spears and javelins don't get enough attention in the modern martial arts or military history worlds as they really should do. But did you know about the jarid? I think a lot of people, especially if you've played Bannerlord, for example, like I do, you might know about the jarid, and you might know that people throw javelins from horseback. You might know about the Gineta and various other people, the Moors in Spain, and in fact the Spanish copied it as well. So it was something you did find in Europe to some extent. Also anywhere that the Ottoman Empire had influence, for example the Balkans, and to a lesser extent Hungary and all the way up to Poland, where they copied some of the kind of Ottoman weapons and styles of fighting. The jarid is probably known there. But did you know that there's still a active sport or martial art, depending how you look at it, using these things? I think it's absolutely amazing, and the skill, the horsemanship that you see exhibited there is just incredible. I wish I could ride like that. Maybe I've finally got the motivation to learn to ride well enough. The rest of my family ride, so maybe I should as well. Anyway, did you know about this? Hopefully some of you now know about the sport of jarid. Maybe if you're in Turkey on holiday, you can try and search it out and see it. I would love to one day. Anyway, thanks a lot for watching. I have, of course, been Matt Easton, and I will continue to be, and I hope I'll see you back on the channel really soon. Cheers, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.